Well, Dan Ashworth has left Manchester United this week after just 5 months in his role as sporting director. Mark, if I come to you first, what's happened, and is this as embarrassing for Ineos as it looks at first glance?
Well, so Dan Ashworth has left his role as sporting director. We know that he left on Sunday. He's been in his role for 5 months. Now, is it embarrassing for Ineos? I guess it's however you want to look at it. I guess this looks like more, I don't know, mismanagement at the club, more kind of chaos. They've been in charge since February. But the flip side is that if it's not working, you've got to make a decision. You've got to end it. So I think that's the situation right now, that Sir Jim Ratcliffe has made this decision. He decided that Dan Ashworth wasn't working for him. It wasn't what he felt that the role should have been. Dan Ashworth wasn't filling the role as he should have done. There's a bit of a personality clash. He didn't feel he was strong enough in certain areas. And I think, there's been various suggestions that summer recruitment wasn't great. I think that's a fact. I think we know that apart from Matthijs de Ligt, who was primarily driven by Erik ten Hag, the other signings, including Joshua Zirkzee, were driven by Dan Ashworth's recruitment department. So, you could say that Nusayr Mazraoui's had a good start, £12 million. That's a deal that looks okay, but the rest, there's still, the jury's out. So the recruitment wasn't great. You've got a window coming up in a month's time in January. They need to make some changes. They need to bring some players in, get some players out. And I guess Sir Jim Ratcliffe wasn't confident that Dan Ashworth was the guy. Now, also, I think Rob might have a kind of a feel for this as well. There's a bit of mystery as to whether Dan Ashworth was to blame for Erik ten Hag staying, was not involved in Erik ten Hag staying, was overlooked, or was phased out of the decision making when he was sacked. Because I've heard both sides. I've heard that Dan Ashworth wasn't involved with the Erik ten Hag retention in the summer. He didn't start till July the 1st, and by that point, United were already announced he was staying. But also, I've heard that he was part of the decision to keep him, despite the fact he was still on gardening leave. So, and he's been blamed for the fact that it was the wrong decision. So, ultimately, Sir Jim Ratcliffe didn't think that Dan Ashworth was doing the job he expected him to do, so they've moved him on.
Yeah, I mean, it is an odd one, James. And to be honest, I would probably side with you in that I think it looks optically, anyway, quite embarrassing. They put so much emphasis on Dan Ashworth when they were hiring him. I think Sir Jim Ratcliffe called him a 10 out of 10 sporting director. Newcastle United made it really, really difficult for them to get him out of Newcastle. And at that time, it would have been very easy for Man United, for Sir Jim Ratcliffe to look elsewhere and say, well, Newcastle are making this really, really tough for us. Is it worth it? Do we need to go and look at someone else? And they were so single-minded in their pursuit of Dan Ashworth. All the conversations, all the way through his gardening leave, when people were asking sort of privately, is this really worth it? Do you need to go and look at someone else? The answer was always no, that Dan Ashworth was their number one choice. So I suppose it does look a little bit embarrassing in that, it would appear that they aren't completely aligned. Dan Ashworth isn't completely aligned in his view of things with Sir Jim Ratcliffe. And you would think that things like that would have come to light during your process of trying to hire him. It also comes at a time when Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Man United are raising ticket prices, and Jim Ratcliffe did an interview with a fanzine last week where he said that they've got no choice but to raise ticket prices because they need to have more money for the first team. Well, it's cost you around £3 million to get Dan Ashworth from Newcastle. It's then cost you money to relieve him of his duties, to pay up his contract. Obviously, it's not going to be £3 million, but there is going to be money involved. You've agreed to give Erik ten Hag a contract extension or extend his contract by a year. You've then sacked him and had to pay him off. You've also had to go to Sporting Lisbon and pay a release clause for Ruben Amorim and a release clause for his staff. All of these things combined at a time when you're telling fans that you have to pay more money for tickets, if nothing else, it just doesn't look great at all. Jim Ratcliffe and Ineos came in, and the expectation was that they knew exactly what they were doing, and they were going to be very, very single-minded and ruthless in their decision making. Well, this decision to hire Dan Ashworth right now obviously looks a poor one. I understand what Mark is saying, and that is certainly the message from Man United, is that if it's not working, then don't prolong the agony and just do it. Get rid of him as quickly as possible. I understand the logic of that, but this whole episode, the fact that he's only been here for 5 months, I think for Ineos, for Jim Ratcliffe, for Man United, it does look quite silly. It does look quite embarrassing.
I think as well, I think that the point here is that it shows that Ineos, when they came in, didn't actually know what they were doing. I think they hired Dan Ashworth on reputation. He's a name they knew, he's a name that people were familiar with in the game. He'd transformed the the FA with his DNA program with Gareth Southgate. He had a great time at Brighton. Went to Newcastle with the same high reputation. But when you start kind of digging into Dan Ashworth's kind of pedigree, which United clearly didn't do, you look at, well, this is the guy that sold Victor Gyökeres from Brighton to Coventry for £1 million. You know, Gyökeres is now the hottest property in Europe, and Dan Ashworth felt that he wasn't capable of cutting it at Brighton. Now, was Dan Ashworth the reason why Brighton was successful with other players, or was it Tony Bloom, the owner's kind of analytics and the way that he's devised the Brighton setup? He goes to Newcastle. Newcastle have had a mixed time, you have to say, under Saudi Arabian ownership. Sandro Tonali was signed despite the issues in his background with the betting situation, which ended up costing him a season of his career. Was Dan Ashworth aware of that? If not, why not? So when you start looking at Dan Ashworth's track record, it doesn't stack up to this 10 out of 10 sporting director that Sir Jim Ratcliffe was talking about. And also, he's not really a sporting director in the classic sense of a guy that has contacts all over the world, knows how to get a player in. Dan Ashworth is a guy that built a structure. He built a structure with the FA. He built one at Newcastle, tried to build one at Newcastle. And I think Sir Jim Ratcliffe looked at it and thinking, okay, you're able at what you do, but you're not what I wanted you to do. And I think what United want is a sporting director who will be aggressive, who will be ruthless, like Sir Jim Ratcliffe is, in getting the right players. And I think Joshua Zirkzee is certainly a player that has left questions being answered. I know that Dan Ashworth and United have been trying to defend that signing by saying that they looked at all the data, analytics really suggested he was a great signing, £38 million, a young player. But sometimes you have to base it on what you see on the pitch. And what we've seen on the pitch from Joshua Zirkzee so far is that he's nowhere near Man United level. And I guess if you've got a month to go before the window opens, and I don't think United will be too busy in the window, but they'll have to do something, or they'll try to do something. You want a guy that you trust to make the right decisions. And, you know, Sandro Tonali wasn't a great deal for Newcastle. Letting Gyökeres go wasn't a great idea for Brighton. Signing Joshua Zirkzee. The momentum's adding up to suggest that, can we trust this guy as the head of our transfer recruitment strategy, or do we need to get somebody else in who, you know, is bringing players in that, you know, look at Chelsea, they've spent over £1 billion, as you know, but they look like they've finally got it right, and they've taken some gambles on young players that a lot of clubs were thinking, is it worth the value? Cole Palmer, what a deal that is. So I think United want to be more aggressive in the transfer market, and that is Dan Ashworth's style.
The one thing I would say, sorry, go on, James.
Well, it's just a couple of things I want to pick. I mean, the Cole Palmer deal is not one I think you should use as an exemplar for other clubs to follow. I mean, he was the third choice in that position for Chelsea when they couldn't get two other deals over the line. You know, they lucked into that, and as I think we've talked about on this podcast before, as Rob knows, they overpaid. Chelsea overpaid at the time. It looks a great deal now, but City wanted, what was it, Rob, 25 million for him, or that was the price they were circulating? Was that right?
Yeah, around that.
Yeah, and they ended up paying 42.5. So you know, that, yes, that's worked out, but I wouldn't necessarily hold that up as being, oh, this is an example of the kind of deal that, you know, that other clubs should follow. What I do think is interesting about Dan Ashworth now,
United aren't looking at any transfer, so that's the point. You know, but you're right in terms of it wasn't top of Chelsea's list, but you still have to put the work in, and the harder you work, the luckier you get. And Chelsea got lucky. United have not been lucky for too long.
Yeah, what's interesting for me in terms of Dan Ashworth is where he goes now, because there was a lot made at the time of Arsenal losing Edu that Richard Garlick, of course, who used to work at West Brom, is now the managing director at Arsenal. He worked with Dan Ashworth. They have a very good relationship. They're still quite close. And I thought it was significant that in some of the sort of conversations around where Arsenal might look, the fact that Garlick knew the sporting director landscape in England, and Arsenal privately have kind of made a point of that, you know, he's one of the guys who's going to be making this big decision for Arsenal, and he already has appointed a sporting director before and knows the market, if you like. I think it'd be really interesting to see whether he picks up the phone to Dan Ashworth now, and whether Dan Ashworth ends up going to Arsenal. I don't have any information at this stage to that effect, but I wonder whether that's somewhere he might go. But guys, we talked a lot about the transfers. I think we should also look at this in the context of Ruben Amorim, because obviously he's only just come in. There seems to be conflicting information about how much of a say Dan Ashworth wanted. Did he actually want to appoint someone else? Is that kind of the root of all this?
Yeah, I mean, the United are making no secret of the fact that Ruben Amorim was an Omar Barada-led appointment, that he was the driving force behind that appointment when they decided to get rid of Erik ten Hag. You know, Mark touched on quite an important point earlier, where he talks about Ashworth as a structure guy, you know, someone who wants to develop the structure all the way through. Well, one of the reasons why City or Man City said that they weren't particularly interested in Amrim is because he comes in with this 3-4-3 system, and all their U teams play 4-3-3, and they wanted that continuity all the way through the club. Well, that's obviously something that Man United have not ignored, but have decided to go against, because Amrim has already come in and said that the U teams and the lower age group teams aren't going to start playing 3-4-3. They're going to play 4-3-3, the way that they've always done. Dan Ashworth is someone who, I mean, James, you'll know better than anyone, the way that he revamped the age group teams at the FA. He is a guy that wants to see, a pattern all the way through an organisation or a football club, and the whole thing should be joined up. Well, Jim Radcliffe has made it very, very clear ever since he came in that his priority is the men's first team. It's come at a cost of the women's team. He's taken an awful lot of criticism about his influence or his impact on the women's team. Even in the interview he gave with the fanzine last week, he's asked about the women's team, and he said again, my priority is the men's first team. Now, Sir Jim Ratcliffe will know that he has got to look after this entire club. He's got to look after the youth development. He's got to look after the women's team, but he's made it very, very clear that his number one priority is to get the men's first team winning. Now, if you've got a sporting director who's saying, well, no, actually, that's not the way that I really work. I want to start building from the ground up. I want to look at, how we recruit under 10s or under 11s and build a pattern all the way through the club. Those two philosophies are completely opposed. And you've got a situation where you ended up looking for a new manager, and there probably are more holistic managers available at the time. You look at managers like Thomas Frank, for example, Gareth Southgate, Graham Potter, who are going to maybe look at developing a pattern and a style all the way through the club. Well, Omar Barada's preference has been someone who's going to come in and just focus primarily on the men's first team. And if you've got a sporting director and a CEO who have got differing opinions, then that relationship, I mean, that's probably the biggest decision that a football club is going to make, isn't it? Who your head coach is going to be. And if you've got a CEO and a sporting director who are directly opposed in what they're trying to achieve by that appointment, then the relationship isn't really going to work.
I think as well that the United structure is interesting, and they've got a lot of people. Obviously, Jason Wilcox was brought in as an Omar Barada appointment. He knows him from Man City, built the academy, went to Southampton. So you've got Jason Wilcox. You've also got Christopher Vavell, who doesn't really get much of a mention. He's the interim head of recruitment who, was at Chelsea for 6 months, a bit like Dan Ashworth at Man United. He left very quickly. But he's there as well. You've got Omar Barada. You've got Dan Ashworth didn't really fit into that system. It was like it was an extra body they didn't need. Now, I can see where United came from here, where Ineos came from. They inherited a club without a structure. Darren Fletcher, who had a great career at United, was the technical director without really the qualifications to do the job. John Murtagh was football director. Now, John Murtagh basically was hired by David Moyes back in 2014 to help build a structure at the club. So the two people that held that role of supposed director of football, sporting director, were really people that had been initially, had made their name as people who build a structure. That is totally different from knowing the best players in the world, the directors of football at different clubs, for having an eye for talent. It's basically a guy in an office with a clipboard who delegates and builds a structure and builds a kind of a flowchart of what organisation reports to the other. That isn't a guy that spends his life looking at scouting reports and looking at the data. And I think that's what United have stumbled upon with Dan Ashworth, realising that actually what we want is not what we've got. Now, where do they go next? I mean, I've been told that for now they'll stick with Jason Wilcox and Christopher Vavell in the roles and try not to complicate things. I think ultimately what United will want, what Sir Jim Ratcliffe will want, is a strong sporting director, somebody who can leave to do what Chika Pagura has done at Man City, what Michael Edwards did initially at Liverpool. Just know the market, bring the players in, find these players that other clubs are looking at that haven't been able to sign, and have some expertise and some, that word again, ruthlessness. That's what Jim Ratcliffe talks about. And I think why I kind of think this is a good move for United rather than an embarrassing one is that for the last 10, 15 years, United have lacked any kind of ruthlessness. Certainly the last 10 years. They haven't shown any willingness to move people on. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer stayed way too long. Ed Woodward stayed way too long. Failure was indulged at United for 10 years. So Jim Ratcliffe has now gone to the other extreme. It's almost like Roman Abramovich's Chelsea. If you don't deliver on day one, you're out. And I think maybe they need a middle ground, but at least we know what Sir Jim Ratcliffe's demands are and what he's going to do. If you don't deliver, you'll be out of the door.
I think you touched on it there again. One of the things that Man United are struggling with at the moment is how much change there've been. Dan Ashworth wasn't dropped into a structure that was already set in stone. That you've got a new co-owner in Sir Jim Radcliffe, you've got a CEO in Barada, you've got Dan Ashworth, the sporting director, Jason Wilcox, you've got a new head coach in Ruben Amorim, who have all started at the club within sort of 6 months of each other. And because of that, and because of some of these roles are changing from what we've seen in the past, you've got an awful lot of quite powerful people all battling for their sphere of influence. And it's interesting that when Erik ten Hag was sacked, because Erik ten Hag was the last manager hired under the last or the old structure and had control of an awful lot of things, that even little things like commercial appearances that the players were doing, that Ten Hag, when he was there, was having to sign off. No, that doesn't come under Ruben Amorim's influence anymore. So that tiny little decision is up for grabs now. Someone has to make that decision and make it their own. And that might seem like a tiny thing, but there are millions of these little tiny decisions and tiny little influences that are up for grabs at the moment at Man United. And they've got all of these people, all these different roles kind of battling for a little bit of power and a little bit of influence. And it is going to take a long time to work that out, because ultimately United, got a long history of winning things. But in terms of modern structure and a modern football club, they are almost starting from scratch. And I think it's probably a good idea for Man United to put their foot on the ball a little bit and not race into another sporting director appointment, and just let Jason Wilcox, step up into that role, at least in the short term. Because if you rush to make another appointment, you're going to face the same issue. You need to let that structure and those people within that structure settle a little bit, and then realize where the gaps in that structure is before you rush to another appointment. And ultimately, I think above anything else, that's what's cost Dan Ashworth his job, that he's been dropped into a role that no one was really sure what it meant and what he was responsible for and what his job was. He thought it was to do a job in a certain way. Clearly, Sir Jim Radcliffe thought it was to do the job in a different way. And then that stuff needs to be worked out before they can move forward. There's been so much change at Old Trafford, and it was key in that statement when they announced that Dan Ashworth was going to leave. They called it a transitional period, and they thanked him for his help in this transitional period. Well, that's exactly what it is. There's been so much change and so many new people coming in that it's going to take a while to settle down and get it working in the way it should do.
James, can I just ask you on, also we know that Arsenal are also in a situation where they're looking for a sporting director, technical director, having let Adu's left. Do you think Adu to the Nottingham Forest Marinakis group is a done deal, or should we look at him as a contender for the United role? Is he somebody that United should look at as a guy that's got a track record, or has that ship sailed?
No, I think that agreement is in place. He's on gardening leave anyway. He's got a 6-month gardening leave period, which obviously takes him into, what would it be, about April next year. And then he's expected to take up that role with the Marinakis group. So I don't think he's a starter really in that race.